Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to look at how to describe vegetation on a topographic map. Now the part of the syllabus that mainly speaks to this aspect of describing vegetation on topographic map is the part of the content that says variations in vegetation in response to differences in rock type, altitude, slope angle, and drainage in a local area. So the map that you'll be getting will be showing a local area, right? And so when you're describing the vegetation, these are some of the things that you will have to bear in mind, that the way that the vegetation will vary on the map will be based on differences in the geology over the map area, differences in altitude of the land or height of the land over the map area, the angle of the slope, whether it is steep or gentle, whether it's a windward slope or a leeward slope, that will also influence the type of vegetation that we see at specific areas on the map. And last but not least, the drainage of the local area. Remember, we're talking about drainage, we're talking about how water move over the land. So we could have drainage could be river, or it could be an area where there's a pond. All right, we can talk about good drainage. River is an area of good drainage. A pond or a swamp or a lake, that's an area of impeded drainage, okay? And then that is also going to influence the type of vegetation that we see from one place to another on the map. Vegetation will also vary according to the nearness to coast. All right, we will talk about that some more as we move along. All right, so when you get your map, it is always important for you to familiarize yourself with the symbols shown in the legend or key. And when you look in the key, the main types of natural vegetation that you often find on those topographic maps are forest, woodland, trees and shrubs, swamps, mangrove. Notice I said natural vegetation. So you might also see other types of vegetation, but those other types of vegetation are agricultural vegetation or cultivated vegetation. So you have to read the questions very carefully to see exactly what you're being asked to talk about. If you're being asked to talk about just natural vegetation, then you don't go into this discussion of agricultural vegetation. But if you're just asked to talk about vegetation in general, then you could talk about both cultivated and natural vegetation. So read the question very carefully and try to understand what is required of you. So let's look at these different types of vegetations briefly. All right, forest and woodland are vegetations that are dominated by trees. All right. The main difference between the two is that the forest tends to be made up of, bigger trees, trees that are larger, taller, and the trees tend to be a little closer, or we could say that there's a higher density in the forest. But the woodland tends to have smaller trees. The trees tend to be shorter, just smaller in size in general, and they tend to be more sparsely located. All right, bear that in mind. Another thing you need to bear in mind that one of the reasons for these differences between the forest and the woodland, usually the forest develops where there is a greater availability of water. Woodland usually develops in areas where there is less moisture available. All right. So, for example, on the leeward side of a slope, you might find woodland, just because those areas are areas where the air will be descending, and as the air descends, it usually gets dry. We talk about the lapse rate. So the dry adiabatic lapse rate will usually operate on the leeward side of the mountain or hill slopes. All right, so we would normally find woodlands in those areas. We also might find woodland in areas like limestone areas where the rock is permeable, and so it's easy for the water that infiltrates into the soil to subsequently percolate through the rock, so less water is available in the soil for the plants. All right, so you find that the plants that develop in those areas are plants that usually have to develop adaptations to dry conditions. So they tend to be deciduous in nature. They tend to have smaller leaves so that they can reduce the amount of transpiration that takes place. A lot of the times they might have thorns, and they usually have longer roots so that they can tap into the groundwater. All right, so those are some of the differences that you need to understand between the woodland and the forest. The forest usually develops in areas where more moisture is available. Now, one thing I need to emphasize in terms of what these two have in common, when we talk about areas that are well settled, like in the Caribbean, people are always trying to find places to live. Woodland and forests usually remain. So it's not that they can't develop in other areas, but they usually remain in hilly areas because people are avoiding those areas for settlement. Whereas in other areas, like lowland areas, people would usually remove these types of vegetation and replace them with settlement. So bear that in mind. So on a lot of the topographic maps that you study, you will tend to find the forest and the woodland in the hilly areas. All right. So on to trees and shrubs. All right. You will also see this on the map. Trees and shrubs, as the name suggests, you will find small trees and shrubs. Remember, shrubs are not the same as trees. They might be similar, but they are not the same as trees. They tend to have less wood. They tend to be smaller. They tend to branch off closer to the ground, etc. Trees and shrubs, again, might, like the woodland, be developed in dry areas where little moisture is available, or they might develop in areas close to human settlement. So look for that you will find a lot of trees and shrubs close to human settlement, which implies that these plants are secondary vegetation. That is, they develop after the natural vegetation has been, or the primary vegetation has been disturbed by human activities. All right, so that is why you usually see trees and shrubs close to human settlement. All right, so we also have wetland vegetation, including our swamps and our mangrove. Now, this is a little tricky because sometimes when you see mangrove, you see it as mangrove forest in some cases. Sometimes you see it as mangrove swamps. All right, how do you differentiate therefore? Mangroves would be found along the coast. Swamps can also be found along the coast, but you'll find the swamps also in inland areas. So the swamps and mangroves usually develop in waterlogged conditions. All right. Another difference, well, both of them can develop in saline conditions, that is where the water is salty. But the swamps can also develop in fresh water. The mangrove, however, because it's along the coast, will develop in saline conditions. All right. So bear those things in mind when you are reading your map. So I'm just going to quickly just look at each of the vegetation types that I just mentioned. All right, just to reiterate the point that I made. So here we have our forest made up of trees. Notice that the trees are close together, so there's a high level of density. Then we have our woodland. Woodland is also dominated by trees, but if you notice, they are more sparse in nature. As I said to you, they usually develop in areas where moisture is low. So they are xerophytic plants. They have to develop adaptations to dry conditions. Then we have trees and shrubs. All right. These are areas where we find small trees along with shrubs. As I said to you, these areas might also develop in dry conditions, or they might develop as secondary vegetation due to human disruption. All right. Then we have our wetland vegetation. A wetland may be defined as a place where the soil is permanently or seasonally flooded with fresh, brackish, or salty water. They can be found both inland or along the coast. And as I said before, most of the swamps are located along the coast. All right, so we have our mangrove swamps. So our mangrove swamps, as you can see, it's close to the sea. Notice the roots are elevated a bit out of the water in order to help the plants to breathe a bit. That is one way in which it adapts to the waterlogged condition. Then we have our swamp, and the swamp, just like the mangrove, is developed in waterlogged conditions, but it doesn't have to be close to the coast. It can also develop inland. All right. Now, when you are describing vegetation, a lot of the times, some of the common questions that you are asked in the map work section is to describe the distribution of vegetation. And you might be asked to explain the distribution of vegetation. All right, you have to know the difference. If you are describing the distribution of the vegetation, you're just talking about what you see, where they are, where the different, you'd have to identify the types of vegetation. So you'd have to name the vegetation types. You would have to say where they are. Now, when you are talking about where they are, there are different ways that you can talk about where they are. You can talk about where they are in terms of grid reference. You can talk about where they are in terms of compass direction, whether they are to the east or to the north or to the south. You could use those to describe where they are. Or you could talk about where they are in relation to other features. So you could talk about whether they are close to the coast or far from the coast, whether they are close to settlement or far from settlements, close to roads, far from roads. You could talk about them, their location also in terms of the direction in which they extend. All right. You could talk about their location also in terms of their altitude, whether they are located in lowland areas or in highland areas. You could talk about whether they are located on steep slopes or on gentle slopes. You could talk, and this is important. Well, all of these things are important anyway. It's important for you to talk about the extent that the vegetation covers. All right, so sometimes they are located just in small areas, in little pockets, in little clusters, or they might extend over a wide area. All right, so when you are describing, these are some of the things that you want to talk about. All right, so I was unable to get a real map to show you, so I had to create the symbols. They are close enough to the real symbols that you would see on the map. So these are some of the symbols that you would see showing the different vegetation types. We have the forest, which is usually green, with some little symbols showing trees. Then you would have woodland. Woodland is, if you notice, look at the difference. Woodland is also shown in green. And then you have trees and shrubs. Trees and shrubs are usually shown by an area where it's green, and then you have some little white patches in the area. All right. Then, as it relates to the wetland vegetation, the mangrove, you will see an area of blue and green because mangrove is a and swamp are vegetation that we find in a transition zone. Transition meaning that it's not totally solid land and it's not totally water. So you'll find areas where it's blue and then you have the green showing the vegetation. All right, so the blue suggests that it's waterlogged. These other symbols that I have here, these are two examples, and there could be a whole lot more of cultivated vegetation. So we have sugar plantation and we have mixed farming. So again, these are vegetation types, but they are cultivated vegetation. Bear that in mind. All right, so let's look at this map. If we notice, we are seeing two types of vegetation. We see to the northeast section of the map, we see an area of forest, and this area is an area along a hill slope. All right, and we also see to the northwest, we see an area, a small area of trees and shrubs. And notice it is close to human settlement. So if you are asked to explain or account for the distribution of the vegetation, then you could explain that the trees and shrubs are located close to human settlement and might be a secondary vegetation which has been disturbed by human activities. In terms of the forest, you could say that the forest is located in the hilly area, and notice that the contour lines are close together, so it's steep. So people might avoid those areas for settlement. So the area remains in its natural state. It is in its natural land use. Okay. All right, here's another map. So notice we have two types of vegetation there. We have our trees and shrub, and notice again it is close to an area where there is human settlement. So it might be that this vegetation developed after the original vegetation was disturbed by human activities. This vegetation might have developed there. And then along the coast we have mangrove, and it's an extensive area of mangrove. All right, and again the mangrove develops there because this area is an area where conditions are harsh, so not many different plant species can develop there. So the vegetation that develops there is a vegetation that is able to adapt to the saline, unstable, waterlogged condition, which is the mangrove. All right, if you had to explain it. All right, now the final one we're going to look at. Notice we have an extensive area of mangrove along the coast. Notice the term I'm using, it's an extensive area of mangrove along the coast. Then we could say that the trees and shrubs are located in pockets or little clusters. Notice we have a small patch of trees and shrubs right here in 2320, and we also have another patch to the southwestern part of 2320. All right, so these are, we could say that they are located in pockets. All right, but then we have an extensive area of woodland. All right, and we could say that the extensive area of woodland is located to the southern, or we could say the southeastern part. The central to southeastern part of the map is covered in an extensive area of woodland. There is also another pocket or cluster of trees and shrubs in 2319, as we can see there. Then if you look carefully, there is also a little pocket of swamp. All right, and that area we can see in the bottom part of 2320 and the top part of 2319. All right, we are seeing a little pocket of swamp. Now, what if you were asked to account for or to explain the distribution of the vegetation types on the map? What could you say? All right, let's talk about the trees and shrubs. We could say that the trees and shrubs are generally close to the to human settlement and may be the result of the original vegetation being disturbed. If we could talk about the mangrove again, and we could say that it's located along the coast because not many types of vegetation can develop along the coast, but these plants are able to adapt to the coastal conditions. All right, what about the woodland? Now, it's very important that when you study your map, you know other things. You know the other things that are related to the main subjects that you're talking about. So even though you're talking about vegetation, remember vegetation doesn't exist in isolation. They are related. So related to other factors. So remember the factors that we talked about that influence variation in local vegetation. We talk about the human activities already. So now we want to talk about geology. Geology seems to play an important part in the location of the woodland. Now, we are not actually seeing the rock on this map, but we see something that suggests something about the map, about the rock. Notice that in this hilly area where we find our woodland, we also find depressions. All right. So these depressions might be the result of carbonation. So this area might be an area of limestone. And what we know about limestone is that limestone is an impermeable rock. And because it is impermeable, it's not going to retain a lot of the surface water. A lot of the water is going to percolate down through the limestone. All right, so we are expecting that the conditions along this area will be generally dry. So this might be the reason why we have woodland in these areas. And it might also be the reason why we have this little area of shrub along here, trees and shrub along this area again, because it is dry. Now this area where we find the swamp, remember we said that swamp develop in areas of impeded drainage. So it could be a case where after the water has infiltrated down through the limestone hill or the limestone rock, this area, notice it is found at the foot of the limestone. So maybe, notice I'm using the word maybe this area is the area where a lot of the water that infiltrated is now flowing outwards, and maybe this is an area where the water table is therefore high, and maybe for these reasons this area is waterlogged, and because of this a wetland develops here, hence the location of the swamp. All right, so those are some of the things that you could talk about as it relates to natural vegetation on your topographic map. All right, notice on this map, we also see cultivated vegetation. All right, if you're asked to talk about the distribution of the cultivated vegetation, you could talk about, for example, the sugar estate. The reason this area, the sugar estate, might be here. Now we have to look at economic reasons and as well as natural reasons. All right, the area is flat. Remember, sugar estates usually use machinery, and so it's easier for them to operate their machinery on areas where it is flat. But there might also be human factors. So we have roads running through, we have a road running through the area, and we have another road close by. So the sugar estate might develop here also because it's close to road, so it's easy for transportation to take place. Then we have an area of settlement right here, so it's easy for them to get a supply of workers from this area of settlement. All right, so that could be another thing. Before I end the video, remember, you could be asked economic questions about economic activities. So that question about agriculture could be a question that is based on economic activities and not necessarily on vegetation. All right. Now, remember, you also do a module where you talk about disparities in development. So even on a map like this, you could be asked to compare the northern section of the map with the southern section of the map in terms of development. Notice that there is a contrast between what we're seeing in the north to what we're seeing in the south too. So the south is mainly vegetation. We're not seeing a lot of roads here. So we find that these areas are not well developed. Again, it might not be well developed because it's not attractive for human settlement, because it's hilly and it is rugged, because it is limestone and it has a number of depressions in the area. So it's not attractive for human settlement. But the northern part is more attractive for human settlement because the land is flat. We're not seeing any contours there. And because it is flat, it's easier for roads to be constructed and buildings to be constructed. And the more we create roads and other infrastructure, then the more people are going to migrate to that area or settle in that area. Hence the difference that we are seeing in the development between the two sections. All right, I hope that this was helpful, and I wish you all the best in your exam. Now, if this was useful for you, if you have not yet subscribed, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. If you know somebody else that this information might be useful to, go ahead and share the video. All right, and go ahead and give this video a thumbs up. All right, thank you.